They told the woman to use the service entrance before they even asked her name. They laughed because her coat was faded, her shoes were scuffed, and her purse looked like it had survived too many winters. They did not notice the calm in her eyes. They did not know the building belonged to her. They did not know the quiet janitor watching from 20 feet away had already lost almost everything except his dignity. And before the night ended, every powerful person in that marble lobby would remember the sound of one poor man saying, "She is not a mess, sir. She is a person." The Whitmore Tower Gala was supposed to begin at 7, but by 6:15 the lobby already shone like a magazine cover, with crystal chandeliers burning above polished stone floors, silver trays moving through the crowd, and executives practicing generous smiles for cameras they trusted more than conscience. Ethan Miller moved along the edge of it all with a mop bucket, a gray uniform, and a name tag most people never bothered to read. He was 38, tired in the shoulders, gentle in the hands, and careful with every dollar because at home his 8-year-old daughter Sophie believed pancakes on Friday nights were a luxury worth celebrating. That morning, she had tucked a folded note into his lunch bag with purple crayon letters that said, "Daddy, don't let anyone make you feel small." Ethan had smiled when he read it beside the vending machines, then placed it in his shirt pocket like a prayer he was too proud to speak. Now he watched a woman step through the revolving doors wearing a plain navy dress beneath an old beige coat, her brown hair pinned simply, her face composed but weary, as if she had walked into a place she owned and still expected it to disappoint her. Her name was Charlotte Whitmore, though no one in that lobby knew it yet. To them, she looked like a lost applicant, maybe a temp worker, maybe someone who had mistaken wealth for welcome. Preston Blake, Chief Operations Officer, saw her first and crossed the floor with Vanessa Clark at his side, both dressed in tailored confidence. "Ma'am, this event is private." Charlotte lifted her chin. "I was invited." Vanessa looked at the worn edge of her sleeve. "By whom, housekeeping?" A few nearby guests chuckled into their glasses. Preston smiled without warmth and pointed toward the rear hallway. "The service entrance is around back. Try not to disturb the donors." Charlotte did not argue. She only held her folder closer, and in that small motion Ethan saw something he knew too well, the discipline of a person refusing to let shame reach her face. Then Vanessa brushed past her and knocked the folder from her hands. Papers scattered across the shining floor like white birds shot down by pride. Preston turned to Ethan. "You, clean up this mess." For one breath, Ethan saw rent, groceries, Sophie's inhaler, the old truck that needed tires before winter. Then he saw his daughter's purple note in his pocket. He set the mop against the wall, walked into the open space, and knelt to gather the pages one by one. The lobby softened into whispers. When he handed the folder back to Charlotte, he did it with both hands, the way his father had taught him to hand back anything that mattered. Preston's jaw tightened. "I told you to clean it up." Ethan stood slowly, not angry, not loud, just steady enough to make the air change. "I did, sir." Vanessa gave a sharp little laugh. "You think a mop makes you a gentleman?" Ethan looked at Charlotte, then back at them. "No, ma'am. It just teaches you what people leave behind when they think no one is watching." Silence moved through the lobby like cold water under a door. Charlotte studied him then, really studied him. The tired eyes, the work-worn fingers, the quiet courage of a man standing between cruelty and a stranger. Preston stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not his contempt. "Careful, Miller. Men in your position don't get to embarrass men in mine." Ethan swallowed, feeling the note against his chest. Then maybe men in your position should be harder to embarrass. Preston Blake stared at Ethan as if the floor itself had spoken out of turn, and for a moment the grand lobby seemed to forget how to breathe. The string quartet near the fountain slowed without stopping. The cameras near the donor wall kept blinking red, and guests who had spent thousands of dollars to be admired suddenly found themselves watching a janitor stand taller than the men in silk ties. Charlotte Whitmore held her folder against her chest, her face still calm, but something behind her clear blue eyes had sharpened. She was stunning, not in the polished way the gala expected, not with diamonds or designer attention, but with a quiet, almost severe beauty that made people look twice before they understood why. Her coat was plain, her shoes were worn, yet she carried herself like winter sunlight over glass, gentle enough to touch, strong enough to reveal every fingerprint. Preston leaned closer to Ethan and spoke through a smile meant for the room. Pick up your mop and remember your place. Ethan lowered his gaze for 1 second, not in surrender, but in discipline. He could hear the old elevator humming behind him, smell lemon polish beneath the perfume of wealthy strangers, feel the folded note in his pocket pressing against his heart. My place is where a person is being treated wrong, he said. Vanessa folded her arms. How noble. Do you practice speeches in the supply closet? A few people laughed again, but softer this time, because laughter becomes nervous when truth steps near it. Ethan did not answer her. He turned slightly toward Charlotte, leaving enough space for her dignity, not making a performance out of kindness. Ma'am, are you all right? Charlotte studied him with a patience that almost looked like sorrow. I am, she said. Thank you. Preston snapped his fingers toward a security guard near the marble column. Remove him from the floor until human resources can process this. The guard hesitated. Everyone knew Ethan. He arrived before dawn, stayed after midnight, fixed broken chairs without being asked, carried packages for elderly visitors, and once spent his lunch break helping a lost child find her mother near the parking garage. He was invisible until someone needed decency. I said remove him, Preston repeated. Ethan reached down, picked up the last fallen page that had slid beneath the edge of a velvet rope, and placed it gently inside Charlotte's folder. He noticed the paper was not a resume. It was a report. Names, dates, complaints, ignored warnings, employee resignations, all printed beneath a small gold company seal he had seen on the executive floor. Charlotte saw his eyes pause, and for the first time, the corner of her mouth softened. Not a smile exactly, more like recognition. Preston noticed the exchange, and his irritation deepened. Do not look at her papers. Ethan stepped back immediately. I was not reading them, sir. I was returning what someone else knocked down. Vanessa's face tightened. This is absurd. He is making a scene. Charlotte finally turned to her. No, he is ending one. That sentence landed quietly, but it carried farther than shouting. Two board members near the entrance exchanged uncertain glances. A young server stopped mid-step with a tray of sparkling cider. Somewhere above them, the elevator chimed, opening onto the mezzanine where more executives were beginning to gather. Preston straightened, sensing control slipping by inches. And who exactly are you to correct my staff? Charlotte looked at Ethan, then at the crowd, then at the grand staircase rising toward the gala hall. She could have ended it right there. One name, one card, one command, and the entire room would have turned pale. But she waited, because she had not come to see who feared power. She had come to see who honored people without it. Ethan, still unaware, moved his mop bucket aside so no one would trip over it. That small act, simple and careful, made Charlotte lower her eyes for a breath. In a building filled with men paid to lead, the poorest father in the lobby was the only one still protecting strangers. The security guard took one step, then stopped, caught between a paycheck and the uneasy knowledge that not every order deserved obedience. Preston saw the hesitation and his face cooled into something harder than anger, a polished kind of cruelty that had learned to wear a tuxedo. Mr. Miller, he said, loud enough for the donors near the fountain to hear. You are on final warning. Ethan looked at him with the tired steadiness of a man who had heard worse from life and still packed a school lunch that morning. Understood, sir. Then, apologize. For what? For interfering. Ethan glanced at Charlotte, then at the papers now held safely in her arms. The chandelier light touched her face, and for a brief second, she looked less like a visitor and more like the answer to a question the building had been avoiding for years. Her beauty was not loud, not dressed in sparkle, not asking permission. It was the kind that made silence stand up straight. Ethan drew a slow breath. I can apologize for speaking out of turn, he said. I cannot apologize for treating her like she mattered. A small sound moved through the crowd. Not applause, not approval, just the first crack in fear. Vanessa stepped forward, smiling as if she could still turn shame into entertainment. That is touching. Maybe we should put it in the charity brochure. Poor single father teaches manners to executives. Ethan's eyes flicked toward her. He had never told her about Sophie. He had never spoken of the small apartment on the east side, the second-hand sofa, the refrigerator covered in spelling tests, the stack of overdue bills hidden behind a cereal box. People like Vanessa collected details the way other people collected jewelry, not because they cared, but because information could be sharpened. Preston tilted his head. Yes, let us talk about responsibility. You have a daughter, correct? 8 years old. Ethan went still. Not frightened. Still. Charlotte noticed it immediately. So did the room. There are names that should never be dragged into a public humiliation, and a child's name is one of them. Preston continued, enjoying the pressure. A man with a child should understand consequences. Ethan looked down at his work shoes, the same pair he had repaired twice with glue, and suddenly the lobby faded into another morning, 3 hours earlier, when Sophie had stood in their tiny kitchen wearing a yellow sweater and one untied sneaker. She had been spreading peanut butter too thick on toast because she said hungry people deserved extra. "Daddy," she had asked, "why do you always say yes, sir, even when people are mean?" Ethan had closed her lunchbox and thought carefully. "Because being polite keeps my hands clean." Sophie had frowned. "But what keeps your heart clean?" He had not known how to answer. So she had written the note in purple crayon, folded it twice, and placed it in his pocket with the seriousness of a judge handing down mercy. Now, under the cold shine of wealth, Ethan touched that pocket with 2 fingers. Preston mistook the gesture for weakness. "There it is," he said. Reality arriving at last. Charlotte turned her head slowly toward him. "Do you often use children to discipline employees?" The question was quiet, but it cut through every whisper. Preston blinked once. "Excuse me." It was a simple question. Vanessa looked suddenly uncertain. The donors stopped pretending not to listen. Ethan looked at Charlotte, still not knowing that the woman beside him could end careers with a signature. To him, she was only someone standing alone while others tested how much humiliation a person could carry. That was enough. "Leave my daughter out of this," Ethan said. No edge, no threat, just a boundary set with dignity. Preston stepped back half an inch, surprised by how firm gentleness could sound. And high above the lobby, behind the dark glass of the mezzanine conference room, a row of board members watched the live security feed in absolute silence. Behind the tinted glass above the lobby, the boardroom had gone as still as a chapel before a confession. 12 directors sat around a long walnut table with untouched coffee, silver pens, and the uneasy faces of people who had been shown the truth before they were ready to admit it. On the largest screen, Ethan Miller stood in his gray uniform beside Charlotte, while Preston Blake performed the kind of arrogance that usually survived because it happened far from witnesses with power. But tonight, the witnesses were watching. Charlotte had arranged it that way. For 6 months, complaints had reached her private office in careful language. Custodians ignored, assistants mocked, older workers pushed aside, single parents punished for emergencies, good employees leaving with quiet resignation instead of legal threats. Every report had Preston's shadow across it, but no one had proof strong enough to move a corporation that loved its image more than its conscience. So Charlotte had entered her own tower without diamonds, without security, without the armor of her last name. She wanted to know whether kindness still lived anywhere below the executive floor. Down in the lobby, Preston adjusted his cuff links and tried to reclaim the room by making his voice smoother. "This has gone far enough. Mr. Miller, gather your belongings after your shift. You are suspended pending review." Ethan heard the words like a door closing in winter. He thought of Sophie's school field trip, the electric bill folded under a magnet shaped like a sunflower, the tiny birthday cake he had promised for Saturday. His throat tightened, but his face stayed calm. Charlotte turned slightly, her profile catching the golden reflection of the chandelier. In that light, she looked breathtaking, not fragile, not ornamental, but composed with the rare beauty of a woman who had carried storms without letting them make her cruel. "For what reason?" she asked. Preston gave a short laugh. "Insubordination. Because he returned my papers? Because he forgot who runs this building." Charlotte looked up toward the mezzanine glass for one measured second. The board members saw it, and several sat straighter. Then she looked back at Preston. "That is an interesting sentence." Vanessa stepped in, nervous now but still reaching for superiority. "Miss, you need to understand corporate structure. There are levels here." Ethan looked at her and spoke softly. "There are levels in a building, ma'am, not in human worth." The young server holding the tray lowered her eyes, and one of the older guests pressed a hand to his chest as if something true had found him late. Preston's expression hardened with embarrassment. "Enough. Security, escort both of them out." The guard did not move. Now, Preston said. The guard swallowed. Sir, she has not done anything wrong. That was when the first real silence fell. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of a room realizing that fear had begun to lose its grip. Charlotte stepped closer to Ethan, close enough that only he could hear her first words. You may lose something for this. Ethan gave the smallest nod. I know. Why stand there anyway? He looked at the floor he had spent years making shine for people who rarely saw him. Because my daughter asked me what keeps a heart clean. Charlotte's eyes softened, and for the first time that evening, her calm nearly broke. Then the elevator doors opened with a silver chime, and 3 board members stepped out onto the mezzanine stairs, their faces pale beneath the gala lights. The 3 board members descended slowly, not with ceremony, but with the heavy caution of people who had just watched their own company fail a moral test in real time. The gala lights poured over the staircase in ribbons of amber and pearl, turning the glass railings into streams of captured fire, while below them the lobby waited beneath a silence so complete that even the soft music seemed ashamed to continue. Preston saw them and forced a confident smile back onto his face. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, spreading one hand as if this humiliation could still be repackaged as leadership, we are handling a minor staff disruption. Charlotte did not look at him. Ethan did, and in the stillness he noticed how fear changes people with money. It does not always make them tremble. Sometimes it makes them perform. Mr. Blake, said Eleanor Hart, the oldest board member, her silver hair swept neatly back, her expression carved from disappointment. Why was the live ethics review feed sent to our conference room? Preston blinked. I beg your pardon. The feed, she said. From this lobby. We have been watching for 11 minutes. A tremor passed through the crowd. Vanessa's face lost its practiced brightness. Preston glanced toward the cameras near the donor wall, then toward Charlotte, and for the first time he seemed to understand that the woman in the plain coat had not entered the building by accident. Still, pride reached for one more mask. Then you saw an employee undermine event protocol. Charlotte finally stepped forward. They saw a father risk his livelihood to protect a stranger you chose to demean. Her voice was gentle, yet it crossed the marble like a bell. Preston turned to her, his temper dressed in. A smile too thin to hide it. You speak as though you have authority here. Ethan felt the room tighten. He wanted to tell Charlotte she did not have to keep standing in that storm. He wanted to offer some ordinary comfort, a chair, a glass of water, a way out. That was how Ethan understood goodness. Not as speeches, not as applause, but as noticing what a person needed before pride let them ask. Charlotte looked almost impossibly beautiful in that moment, her calm face framed by soft light from the crystal fixtures, her eyes bright with restraint, her presence no longer hidden by the old coat, but somehow magnified by it. She did not seem rich. She seemed rightful. Authority, she said, is not the same as character. Preston gave a short laugh, but no one joined him. This is ridiculous. No. Eleanor Hart answered from the stairs. It is revealing. The second board member, Malcolm Reed, looked at Ethan. Mr. Miller, is this the first time management has spoken to you this way? Ethan froze. The honest answer could cost him more than the lie. He saw Sophie's yellow sweater in his mind, her careful handwriting, the way she always left one bite of dinner on her plate in case he wanted it. He lowered his eyes, then lifted them again. No, sir. A murmur moved through the guests. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Vanessa whispered, this is not the place. Charlotte turned to her. It became the place when you made cruelty public. Preston stepped close enough to Ethan to make the warning plain without raising his voice. Think carefully. You may still walk out of here with a job. Ethan looked at the mop bucket beside the velvet rope, then at the donors, the directors, the servers, the guard, and finally at Charlotte. A job matters, he said. But my daughter has to know what kind of man came home from it. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman covered her mouth. The young server blinked away tears. Eleanor Hart closed her eyes for 1 second, as if ashamed that a janitor had said what an entire boardroom should have protected long ago. Then the front doors opened behind them, letting in a cool December wind, and a small girl's voice called from the entrance, clear and worried, Daddy. Sophie Miller stood just inside the revolving doors with her backpack slipping from one shoulder and a small paper pharmacy bag held tightly in both hands. Beside her was Mrs. Alvarez, her after-school program teacher, breathless from the cold and apologetic before anyone even spoke. The December air followed them in, carrying the scent of snow from the sidewalk and the distant sound of traffic along Madison Avenue. But the child saw none of the crystal lights, none of the black suits, none of the silver trays. She saw only her father standing alone in the middle of a room, full of people who looked at him like he had taken up too much space. "Daddy," Sophie said again, smaller this time. Ethan's entire face changed. The steadiness remained, but tenderness came through it like morning through curtains. "Hey, sweetheart." He took one step toward her, then stopped, aware of every executive watching, every whisper waiting to become a judgment. Mrs. Alvarez lifted the pharmacy bag. "I am sorry, Mr. Miller. Sophie realized you forgot her allergy medicine in your truck, and the office called, but you did not answer." She was worried. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. The one night he could not make a mistake, and life had placed his child in the center of it. Preston saw the opening before compassion could reach him. "Well," he said, smoothing his lapel, "this is unfortunate timing." Charlotte turned her gaze toward him, and something in her expression went very still. Not cold, not angry, simply exact. Vanessa leaned toward a guest and murmured, "This is why personal problems do not belong at professional events." Sophie heard enough. Children often hear the sentence adults think they have hidden. She walked past the velvet rope, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the shining floor, and stood beside Ethan. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Ethan said quickly, kneeling to her height. "No, baby. You did exactly right." Her eyes moved to Preston. "Then why is everyone mad at you?" Ethan touched the folded note still inside his pocket. "Because sometimes doing the right thing makes people uncomfortable." Sophie nodded as if this made more sense than all the grown-up faces around her. Then she looked at Charlotte, and the softness in the little girl's voice changed the room more than any speech could have. "Were they mean to you too?" Charlotte lowered herself slightly so she would not tower over the child. In the glow of the chandelier, she looked almost unreal, her beautiful face quiet with feeling, her old coat catching gold at the edges like something humble made holy by light. "They tried to be," she said. Sophie glanced back at her father. "But Daddy helped." Charlotte smiled then, not the public smile of a billionaire, not the careful smile of a woman used to cameras, but a real one, trembling at the edges with grace. "Yes, your daddy helped when no one else did." Preston cleared his throat. "This is very touching, but we have a gala to run." Eleanor Hart looked at him as if he had finally said the wrong thing at the perfect time. Ethan stood with Sophie's hand in his. He did not hide her behind him. He did not use her to make himself look noble. He simply held on, because every father knows there are moments when a child becomes the reason courage does not leave. Preston pointed toward the rear hall. "Mr. Miller, take your daughter and leave the premises." Sophie squeezed Ethan's fingers. "Does that mean you lost your job?" The question broke something open in the lobby. Ethan looked down at her, and all the fear he had swallowed rose close to the surface, but he would not let it teach her shame. "Maybe," he said gently, "but I did not lose myself." Charlotte slowly rose to her full height. The board members on the staircase did not move. The cameras blinked on. The gala screen above the donor wall flickered from a gold charity logo to a live image of the lobby, and Charlotte Whitmore finally removed a small silver card from inside her folder. When Preston saw the name printed on it, the color drained from his face before she said a single word. Charlotte Whitmore held the silver card between two fingers, and the entire lobby seemed to lean toward it without moving. The gala screen above the donor wall sharpened, the gold logo fading into a clean white corporate seal, and beneath it appeared the words that changed the temperature of the room. Charlotte Evelyn Whitmore, founder and chief executive officer, Whitmore Global. No one spoke. Even Sophie, still holding Ethan's hand, looked from the screen to the woman in the old coat with wide, wondering eyes. Preston stared at the card as if it had become a mirror he could not bear to face. Vanessa took one backward step, her polished confidence suddenly too fragile for the marble beneath her heels. Charlotte did not raise her voice. She did not need volume when truth had finally been given a microphone. "Good evening," she said, facing the lobby, the staircase, the cameras, and the board members watching from above. "For those who do not recognize me without a press release, my name is Charlotte Whitmore." A sound passed through the guests, a low wave of disbelief, then vanished into a deeper hush. Ethan's grip loosened around Sophie's hand, not because he wanted to let go, but because the world had tilted beneath him. The woman he had protected, the stranger he had thought powerless, owned the tower, the gala, the company, and probably every decision that could save or ruin his life. Charlotte turned to him first. Not to Preston, not to the board, to Ethan. Mr. Miller, you treated me with respect when you believed I had nothing to offer you. Ethan swallowed. Ma'am, I did not know. That is exactly why it matters. Sophie looked up at her father with the kind of pride that makes a tired man stand straighter without trying. Preston opened his mouth, but Charlotte lifted one hand, and the smallest gesture stopped him. You have spoken enough tonight. Eleanor Hart reached the lobby floor and stood beside Charlotte. Malcolm Reed joined her. The third board member, David Lang, looked toward the security camera with a face gone pale from recognition, because this was no longer an awkward incident. It was evidence. Charlotte faced Preston again. In the beautiful glow of the gala lights, with winter pressing softly against the glass doors and every chandelier shining above them like patient stars, she looked less like a billionaire revealing herself, and more like justice remembering its name. For 6 months, she said, I received reports that this company had begun rewarding arrogance and punishing humility. I was told it was exaggerated. I was told it was personality conflict. I was told good people were simply not resilient enough. Her eyes moved toward the servers, the custodial staff near the rear hallway, the assistants standing stiffly beside the registration table. Tonight, I learned the truth in less than 15 minutes. Vanessa's lips trembled. Ms. Whitmore, I am so sorry. I had no idea. Charlotte looked at her with a sadness sharper than anger. You had every idea. You simply thought she had no one important behind her. Preston tried again, softer now. Charlotte, this can be handled privately. It was private for too long, she answered. That is why it survived. The sentence landed, and every person in the room understood that something larger than one man's cruelty had been exposed. Ethan felt Sophie lean against his side, and he placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. He was not celebrating. Men like Ethan did not know how to celebrate another person's downfall. He only felt the strange ache of being believed after years of being overlooked. Charlotte turned toward the board. Effective immediately, Mr. Blake is suspended pending a full independent review. Ms. Clark will be placed on administrative leave. All employee complaints from the last 2 years will be reopened by outside counsel, and every hourly worker in this building will be interviewed without management present. Preston's face emptied of its performance. Vanessa lowered her gaze. The crowd remained silent, not because they were afraid of power, but because dignity had finally entered the room and taken its rightful place. The decision settled over Whitmore Tower like snow, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. No one cheered. No one dared turn justice into entertainment. Preston Blake stood beneath the chandelier with his hands at his sides, his expensive watch flashing under the light, suddenly useless against the weight of his own choices. Vanessa Clark looked toward the rear hallway where the servers end. Custodians stood together, and for once, she could not find a sentence that made her feel above them. Charlotte Whitmore handed the silver card to Eleanor Hart, then turned fully toward Ethan and Sophie. The lobby around them was breathtaking now, not because of the flowers, the crystal, or the sweeping staircase, but because truth had made the room honest. Outside, December snow began to fall against the tall glass walls, soft flakes drifting through the city glow like tiny white prayers, while inside the marble floor reflected every face that had been forced to look at itself. Sophie whispered, Daddy, is she famous? Ethan lowered his voice. I think she is more than famous, sweetheart. Charlotte heard him and smiled gently. Famous is just what people call you when they know your name, but not your heart. Sophie thought about that with serious eyes. My daddy has a good heart. The words were simple, but they reached places money could not enter. Charlotte knelt again, careful and graceful, her old coat folding around her like a promise she had chosen not to hide behind anymore. Yes, she said. He does. Ethan looked away, because praise made him more uncomfortable than insult. He had spent years surviving by being useful, not noticed. Compliments felt dangerous, like something that could be taken back. Charlotte rose and faced the employees near the hallway. Every person working tonight will be paid double time. Every hourly worker in this building will receive a paid day for the interviews next week. No manager will be allowed in those rooms. A soft sound moved through the staff, not excitement exactly, but relief trying to believe it was allowed to exist. Malcolm Reed nodded and made notes on his phone. Eleanor Hart wiped one corner of her eye without pretending otherwise. Preston finally spoke, his voice low and strained. Charlotte, after all I have built here, you are going to let one janitor define my career? Charlotte turned to him slowly. No, Mr. Blake. You defined it. He revealed it. That sentence left him with nothing to hold. Ethan felt Sophie squeeze his hand again, and he knew she would remember this night differently than he would. He would remember the fear, the rent, the terrible moment when his child saw him almost lose everything. She would remember that her father stood straight. Charlotte stepped closer to him, her expression luminous beneath the gala glow, beautiful in a way that seemed made of mercy and command together. Mr. Miller, she said, I would like to ask you something, but not here and not as a performance. Ethan shook his head slightly. Ma'am, I am not looking for a reward. I know, she said. That is why I trust you with responsibility. The board members exchanged glances. Preston looked up sharply, but Charlotte did not look away from Ethan. Whitmore Foundation is launching a dignity initiative for working parents, hourly employees, and families living one emergency away from losing everything. I need someone who understands that life from the inside. Not a consultant, not a speechwriter, a leader. Ethan stared at her as if she had spoken in a language Hope had forgotten to translate. I clean floors. Charlotte's answer came softly. Tonight you clean something far more important. The room held its breath. Sophie looked up at her father, then at Charlotte, and with the courage only children possess, asked, Does that mean Daddy can still come to my school play? For the first time, quiet laughter warmed the lobby, tender and human. Charlotte smiled. I think it means he will have a better seat. Ethan bent his head, and for one sacred moment, the man everyone had overlooked had to fight back tears because being seen felt heavier than being ignored. 3 weeks later, Whitmore Tower looked different, though the glass still rose into the Manhattan sky, and the lobby still carried the soft scent of winter flowers. The chandeliers remained, the marble still gleamed, the grand staircase still curved upward like a promise, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of people afraid to speak. It was the quiet of people learning to listen. Preston Blake's name had disappeared from the executive directory. Vanessa Clark had not returned to the gala floor. An independent review had opened doors that had been closed for years, and one by one employees who had swallowed disrespect in order to keep food on the table began telling the truth without trembling. Ethan Miller did not become rich overnight. That would have been too small a miracle for a man like him. Instead, he was given an office with a window, a simple desk, and a title he still felt shy reading aloud: Director of Working Family Dignity Programs. On his first morning, he arrived 30 minutes early out of habit, wearing his only navy suit and the same repaired shoes, polished until they carried the light. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, holding Sophie's purple crayon note in his hand. Charlotte had framed it and placed it on his desk before he arrived. Beneath it, on a small brass plate, were the words, What keeps a heart clean? Ethan touched the frame with 2 fingers and looked away before the tears could finish forming. That afternoon, Charlotte came by without cameras, without assistants, wearing a cream coat and carrying 2 cups of coffee from the street cart outside. She looked radiant in the pale winter sun, not because wealth followed her, but because mercy seemed to have settled peacefully in her face. How does it feel? She asked. Ethan looked around the room, then toward the custodial staff passing the open door without lowering their eyes anymore. Strange, he said. Good strange. Charlotte smiled. That is where second chances often begin. By Friday evening, the first foundation meeting filled a community room in Queens with single mothers, warehouse workers, bus drivers, caregivers, janitors, and fathers who had spent too many years being treated as if exhaustion were a personal failure. Ethan did not speak like an executive. He spoke like someone who knew the sound of a refrigerator running low, the fear of a late notice, the sacred weight of a child asleep in the next room. People listened because he had not climbed above them. He had come back with a lantern. Spring arrived slowly, washing the city in rain and dogwood blossoms, and with it came Sophie's school play. Ethan sat in the front row this time, not checking his phone for missed shifts, not worrying about losing pay, not standing in the back near the exit. Charlotte sat beside him, quietly applauding with the other parents, beautiful and unguarded in a soft blue dress, her eyes bright when Sophie stepped onto the little stage dressed as a sunflower. Sophie found her father in the crowd and smiled so wide that Ethan pressed one hand over his heart. After the play, she ran into his arms and whispered, "Daddy, you got the best seat." Ethan held her close. "Yes, sweetheart, I did." Charlotte watched them beneath the warm school hallway lights, and for once her billion-dollar world felt less important than one honest embrace. Months later, on Christmas Eve, snow fell over the city in gentle sheets. Ethan and Sophie were home in their small apartment, where paper snowflakes hung in the window and cinnamon filled the kitchen. A knock came at the door. When Ethan opened it, Charlotte stood there with an apple pie, no driver behind her, no photographers, only grace in her smile and snowflakes melting in her hair. Sophie cheered and pulled her inside before Ethan could find formal words. They ate from mismatched plates, laughed over too much whipped cream, and watched the city lights flicker beyond the glass like stars brought down to earth. Ethan looked at his daughter, then at Charlotte, then at the framed crayon note now resting on the bookshelf, and understood the miracle at last. Kindness had not made him powerful. It had kept him whole until the right people could finally see him. And somewhere far above the noise of pride, the world grew quiet enough to honor a poor father who never shouted for respect, but lived with enough dignity to make an entire room fall silent.